Dr. Anna Lembke, welcome back to the How Humans Work podcast. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again. I'm happy to be here.
Me too. Me too. As we were just starting to talk about, I've been in your work again after 2 years since you were on the show last, and it's been amazing to revisit Dopamine Nation, the book, and just continue to look at the world of dopamine and the influence it has in our relationships, in our lives. And I've been interested in stress for a long time. It's like somehow it just kind of got into me as a thing to think about, a thing, an
Mhm.
aspect of human experience. And so my third season here is a season on, I call it the nature of stress and studying stress and what are different dimensions of how stress plays out in our lives or people's experiences with stress, yada, yada, all that kind of world of stress. And I wanted to invite you back to really talk about the intersection of dopamine and stress and where those two aspects of our lives or the motivational system that dopamine's part of and the stress system. And so I did a little thinking about it, and I thought they actually share quite a few things in common. In both cases, uncertainty is a thing. It really matters between dopamine and stress. Both have toxic and healthy relationships. Like there's really super beautifully healthy stress, and there's also, as we know, toxic stress or harmful stress. And then that's also true with our relationship with dopamine and pleasure and pain.
Hmm.
Um, they both impact motivation and behavior.
Hmm.
And I like your language in your book where you talk about mindsets of scarcity and plenty, which I think in the world of stress, the language is often threat and opportunity, that deep perception. So they're both tied into our stress response is tied in as well as our probably our motivational system. And then the time dilation and the narrowing and the shrinking of time. We talked about that on the last show. Still a really fascinating part of human experience where time perceptions shift and they share that. And then they also have like brain connections. They both have projections into the PFC and the pituitary and the hypothalamus. So I like to just introduce a big chunk of material and let you begin to work with it, and we can find our way.
That's great. I love the parallels that you've drawn between stress and kind of our dopamine reward pathway, especially the kind of recognition of the balance between sort of good and bad and harmonizing and optimizing stress, but the ways in which too much stress or chronic stress or the wrong kinds of stress can be really undermining. I like that dialectic as a frame because I think it just captures the true state of affairs, which is, we wouldn't want no stress, right? There's this sort of optimal amount of stress that we need as organisms to thrive, but there's a tipping point, or there are kinds of stress that are ultimately, not optimal and not healthy. And when I think about the relationship between stress and compulsive overconsumption, what vividly comes to mind always first for me is this amazing experiment in which rodents, rats and mice, were trained to know that if they pressed a lever, they would get a release of, intravenous cocaine, for example, or methamphetamine would be delivered to their system. And we know that rats, once they discover that, especially in a cell where there's not much else to do, they will essentially press that lever until exhaustion or until they die. But if that lever ceases to emit cocaine, so essentially the cocaine is no longer forthcoming, that behavior will ultimately extinguish. Another way of saying they'll stop pressing the lever and they'll go do something else. But if then you expose that organism to a very painful foot shock, which is one of the ways that neuroscientists simulate extreme stress, the first thing the animal will do is run over and start pressing the lever for cocaine. So I think that's just a very nice paradigm to draw this immediate connection between stress and dopamine or addictive behaviors, which is to say, once we as organisms have learned that there's this thing that I can do that will change the way I feel, even if in the long term it's maladaptive, which addiction is by definition maladaptive, then even once I've stopped doing that behavior, I've extinguished that behavior, I've gone on to something else. In the context of an extreme stressor, I reflexively resort to, or am vulnerable to resorting to, reinstigating or reinitiating that maladaptive behavior again. I just think it's just a great reminder for one aspect of this relationship between dopamine and stress.
Yeah. And so in this case, when I guess we'd put it more in the harmful or overwhelming level of stress, there's a need for some kind of regulation in the system. So is there a deeper layer to that where dopamine or reward-based behaviors are, and I guess, does that fall into the realm of self-soothing or self-regulation type searching that the rat would do in this case?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's maladaptive coping. By definition, addiction is a form of psychopathology. But I think why it's so powerful for me is because it speaks to the enduring quality of these neural circuits, and how, let's just transition to humans, how even after cessation of these maladaptive behaviors, and even after sustained recovery and abstinence, or however that individual defines recovery, they can have an experience where that latent circuit is reignited. And that experience, there are different things that can reignite it, but an extreme stressor is certainly one of them. And the power with which that sort of latent or dormant neural circuit can be reignited is just, it's lifetime. Do you know what I mean? That's what's so incredible to me. And of course, my wonderful colleague, Edie Sullivan, who's looked at alcohol use disorder, its effects on the brain, on the human brain, and also what happens in recovery, has shown that those damaged addiction circuits in recovery, they go dormant, but they never actually heal. Instead, the healing process is kind of rerouting around those damaged areas, creating new neural circuits that then become activated and dominant. But those old circuits, never entirely disappear. And I think here you get sort of a lifetime trajectory function as well. If we started early in our lives, then those circuits are even more likely to be, sort of life lasting, right? Because we lose plasticity as we age. So it's this, what's called this, addiction's the cunning and baffling, just the enormous humility I think we need to maintain in the face of these maladaptive addictive behaviors.
I guess it'd be helpful for somebody who isn't familiar with you to talk a little bit about your specialty in addiction medicine, and a little bit of just rephrasing the basic relationship and structure of dopamine and its role in relationship to addiction.
Sure. So I'm a psychiatrist, which means I've gone to medical school. I'm here on the faculty at Stanford. I have the classic three-legged stool of academic psychiatry. I see patients, I teach, and I do research. And my work over the past 20 plus years has been focused on the disease of addiction, which broadly defined is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self or others. There's no brain scan or blood test to diagnose addiction. It's based on what we call phenomenology or patterns of behavior. But there is indeed a pattern in the brain or a manifestation of the disease of addiction, even though we're not yet at the state of the art where we can use, kind of neurobiological measurements to diagnose it. We still diagnosed it based on these maladaptive patterns. Dopamine is a brain reward neurotransmitter. It is fundamentally involved in the process of addiction. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it is used by neuroscientists commonly as a way to measure the addictive potential of substances, as well as what happens in the brain as we get addicted. The main finding there is that things that are reinforcing or potentially addictive release a dopamine, release a lot of dopamine relatively in a dedicated part of the brain called the reward circuitry, which consists broadly of the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area, which are rich in dopamine releasing neurons, communicating with the prefrontal cortex, which is that large
Right.
gray matter area behind our foreheads.
Yeah.
And what happens just really in broad brushstrokes in the disease of addiction is that with repeated consumption of highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, which release a lot of dopamine,
Yeah.
our brains try to compensate or adapt to that by downregulating dopamine neurotransmission by, for example, involuted postsynaptic dopamine receptors. But in response to flooding of dopamine repetitively over time, the way that our brains compensate is by downregulating dopamine transmission, not just to baseline tonic levels of dopamine firing, but actually below baseline, so that we go into a chronic dopamine deficit state. Now this is the addicted brain, where now we need to use our drug not to get high, but just to feel normal and restore baseline levels of firing. And when we're not using, we're walking around in this dopamine deficit state, which is a state of allostasis as opposed to homeostasis, where we've essentially had to change our hedonic or joy set point as a way to compensate.
That was amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so we're talking about the maladaptive relationship right now with dopamine, right? So this is,
that's right.
In your case, this is where dopamine, the normal dopamine processes become maladaptive because they get exaggerated hits that then change the set point of what feels like normal should be or how we feel okay anymore.
That's right. And I always want to qualify that, again, this is an oversimplification of the homeostatic process. It's not as simple as dopamine. It's a very complex circuit that we're only now beginning to understand. Yeah. But broadly speaking, dopamine can act as a kind of metaphor to understand what's happening to many different chemicals in the brain.
Great. Awesome. So it's far more than dopamine. And you started to presence this idea of a little brain circuitry that was injured.
That's right.
And I started to feel a little sadness around that. Say that circuitry doesn't necessarily.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Kill. Or it starts to be like, oh, okay, that's this learning part of our brain, right? If I'm a rat and I get an overwhelming thing I don't know what to do with, I'm looking for what's familiar to me. I was given a box with Coke and nothing else. So
right.
That's what I'll go for. That's what I learned how to self-regulate, which says a lot about environments and how the options presented make a big difference in terms of what behavioral repertoire is available to anyone.
That's right.
So there's that scarred tissue, and I'm actually wanting to focus on that right now, and a little bit is just like, oh, that's the substance all of us have in our brains, or that little circuitry, or those neurons, or that little pathway, and so what's actually happening there, I guess, as part of my question, is as best you can explain it.
Well, I mean, we don't know exactly what's happening. But what's very clear from animal studies as well as from human experience is that once those addictive patterns of behavior have taken root in the brain and become firmly established, we can disrupt those behaviors and adapt and develop new behaviors. But those original established circuits never entirely disappear. So let me just describe another study, which again, I think is informative.
Great.
So rats were exposed to injections of cocaine over a 7-day period. And typically, I think it was cocaine or methamphetamine, it was something in the stimulant category. Typically rats, in a caged environment will keep themselves to the borders of the cage. They won't venture out into the exposed middle areas. But what happens with subsequent injections of cocaine over a week period, by the way, it's the same amount of cocaine every day, is that the rat will gradually move more and more often into the middle of the cage and will gradually start running faster and faster, so that by day 7, the rat is now in a running frenzy all over the cage. If then the injections of cocaine are stopped, that rat will eventually revert back pretty quickly to hiding in the shadows, in the corner of the cage. If then you wait a year, which is essentially a rat lifetime, and then expose that animal to a single injection of cocaine after it hasn't had any cocaine or anything like it for a year, the rat will immediately launch into a running frenzy as it had on day 7. So again, this is just one more example showing that a lifetime for a rat of abstinence, which is a year, of not being exposed to this substance after a year, after that lifetime with a single re-exposure, is immediately plummeted into this kind of the behavior that it manifested on day 7. We see that in humans too. So humans can be in sustained recovery for long periods of time, get a single exposure to their drug or a similar drug, and plunge immediately into the depths of their addiction. So I don't say this, this is not, this should, I'm not, let me emphasize this. This can be a depressing notion.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be, because first of all, humans are not rats. Secondly, we know that many people with severe addictions get into recovery and stay in recovery for their lifetime. Okay. That many addictions are characterized by relapses, large and small, but that's part of the disease process. People from those relapses are able, again, to get into recovery for sustained periods. But the truth of the matter is that these kind of latent echoes are very powerful, and that people with severe addictions will describe them phenomenologically as relapses that, whether suddenly submerged into the depth of their behaviors, or even just the echoes through craving, right? So people, places, and things, something that they see that reminds them, or even their own euphoric recall. And it's like that whole process gets stimulated again, even if they're able to withstand it and don't relapse.
Which gets into the point of us both being delicate and resilient. There's like this paradoxical situation where it also says something to me about the depth of learning in brain circuitry. And it's just like, whatever we do, whatever we experience, you can't unsee or unlive the things.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
That's a truism, or a truth that's profound and has its own power to it. But this delicacy between, or this paradox between being, well, at some level, we're highly delicate, in another way we're also pretty amazingly hardy and resilient. And I think you're kind of talking about both of those as being part of the human experience, or part of the truth around when we get into a wacky relationship with our pleasure and reward system.
Yeah, and I would add that part of our resilience is our ability to recognize and admit our vulnerability in the face of some of these very hardwired, very reflexive behaviors that we are all vulnerable to, given enough stress and enough access, in the environment. And that's, I think, just really key.
Yeah. And there's definitely enough access and enough stress, which is part of the thesis of Dopamine Nation, is the access is just incredible. And the stress is in many ways there as well. So is there a kind of, well, I guess I'm thinking a little bit about people who are in serious recovery, and how important that taking care of themselves and that stress management part of life is so critical to not being on the precipice of, falling back into a complete relapse.
Yeah. And I think that's what you'll see in people who get into sustained recovery, is that they recognize their enduring vulnerability, and hence they arrange their lives with that recognition front and center. And because of that, they're able to actually stay in long-term recovery and have these wonderful, healthy, thriving lives. And I would even add, because I think many of them would agree, their lives are better for them having to be in recovery, for having to suffer from the disease of addiction, because the wisdom that they've learned about how it's necessary for them to live in order to not relapse is also a wisdom that informs every aspect of their lives and improves their lives as a result.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said. And one of the things I walked away from our last conversation with was a profound appreciation for homeostasis. Like usually in the science class or biology or psychology talk about this concept of homeostasis, but you just described homeostasis at such a deep level, where out of addiction comes wisdom, and so that level of being with the human story and the human experience at that level is so much more interesting. I mean, dopamine's super fascinating and how it works, but my heart always gets more alive and more interested in when we talk about, oh, yeah, when these hard experiences happen in people's lives, there's a deeper well, even deeper than maybe the scarred or maladaptive thing that starts to erupt and maybe makes the secondary circuits and starts to realize
Right.
how I'm dealing with my life,
Right.
not dealing with it matters here, and I can actually do something about it. So
Right.
I just want to plug that. So thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah.
No, it's good. It's good. So I want to get into stress a little bit. So what is it about stress in your mind, whatever level of stress? I mean, in a certain way, we're talking about the healthy kind of stress where people go and they work out and they walk and they do things that are hard and interesting and they have real conversations with their family members and they get in those uncomfortable positions in the recovery. Like people learn the wisdom of recovery. It's like, yeah, I actually need to do that, you know. And then what is it about stress you think that makes us vulnerable to the maladaptive aspects of dopamine or pleasure and reward?
Yeah. Well, I think it's got to be the right amount of stress. Plus, we have to have the right mindset about the stress. So it's both, fundamentally, like physiologically, is it the kind of stress and the amount of stress that our bodies can handle? And then secondly, how do we interpret it? Because we have these great big frontal lobes, that have all these top down processes that really affect how we perceive sensory experience or our experiences more generally, that can then in turn have a big effect on the chemical cascade that results from it, is any deviation from homeostasis.
Uh-huh.
So obviously we're deviating from homeostasis all the time,
Yeah.
right? Because our environment is changing all the time, both in our bodies, in the external world. And we're organisms who have evolved to both recognize the deviation from homeostasis and to take action to restore homeostasis. That's essentially what we do as living organisms.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, that definition, the definitional deviation, every single time from any homeostatic baseline in all our physiologic processes sets off our stress response. The adrenaline that we get from the deviation is part of what allows us to then do what we need to do reflexively and metacognitively in order to get back to homeostasis. So, stress is our friend in the sense that it mobilizes or recruits these chemical cascades that enable us to be able to cope with the changing environment, which is the environment. It is constantly changing, and we need to adapt to it. But obviously, if it's an overwhelming amount of stress that in which we either feel helpless to restore homeostasis or actually are unable to restore homeostasis in that context, then you set the organism up for a difficult and troubling situation, which will then lead to a disease process rather than lead to this kind of optimal sort of reorganization that allows us to move through the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm just thinking through a couple things here. I guess what I'm thinking about a little bit is the maybe the self-medication aspect of it, like where, well, I'll start with this. My definition for stress is any challenge to our attention and any demand on our attention or energy which challenges us. Right. So it's that kind of like a similar idea to what you're saying about the biological homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
And so that can be amazing, right? Like being challenged
Mm-hmm.
and having our attention and energy, like having loads on it and pressure in our system can be really amazing. And obviously it's a dose dependent kind of situation or
Mm-hmm.
a context dependent kind of situation on, safety, scarcity, which are complementary word for scarcity.
Plenty.
Plenty. Yeah. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've been looking for a better word than opportunity because I like threat and opportunity, but opportunity just sounds opportunistic.
Right.
And so plenty's actually and scarcity are really simple and very relatable. So I think that's a really good frame.
Mm-hmm.
But Yeah, so that's my definition of stress and how I think about stress. And then I start to think about, well, what happens when we get loaded, or we have inputs and we have demands on our system. And then when we don't know how to deal with that, or we're given maladaptive resources, or we talked a little bit about this the last time, how we live in zoos and sometimes the environments don't have the kind of intimacy or the personal relationship or the support for us to learn adaptive solutions.
Right.
And so we know that's true. And so I see stress as kind of a setup for looking for resources, like in the realm of food. I'm going to need more calories,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
so the deep part of the brain somehow knows this, but the person who's doing the behavior, maybe eating the food they know they shouldn't be eating, then goes through
Mm-hmm.
like the cycle of feeling bad about it or feeling like they're not in control of their lives, right? So I guess what I look at with stress is it kind of sets up maybe some behavioral and some decision making when it's maladaptive that leads to poor behavioral choices, but also that those poor behavioral choices have kind of an intelligence in them that's just a little bit misaligned. That say, I am more stressed right now, so
Mm-hmm.
I do need more energy. So
Mm-hmm.
I do need a little bit more food right now, or these days
Mm-hmm.
I'm working harder.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? So
Mm-hmm.
and this is, I'm just chatting here a little bit, but this is part of one of the things I am interested in my bias is to redeem our internal circuits, to redeem these motivations we have with stress, or in this case, or the situations we have with stress, or in this case with pleasure and our seeking system and our desire and our motivation. How do we restore those in an environment that puts us in a kind of compromised situations where they come out really clumsy, and they come out sometimes very harmful and damaging? So mm,
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great point that this world that we live in today kind of conspires against us. We experience stress. We naturally want to try to get back to our calmer baseline, and we're given lots and lots of maladaptive ways to do that. Eating cupcakes, binging on Netflix, smoking pot, drinking, whatever it is, which in the short term do work, right? Those do in the short term restore a kind of homeostasis. But really, in the long term, the brain recognizes that as a false friend. And in fact, that requires the brain to do more work to adapt to those surges of dopamine, which then in turn trigger more of a stress response. So again, what works in the short term is actually creating more stress and more maladaptive in the long term. But it's really hard to recognize that because in that single moment, it really does work. So I think this really requires both a lot of psychoeducation about what quick fixes or immediate anxiolytics, pain relievers, whatever they are, what they're doing to us in the short term versus how they're really making things worse in the long term. And importantly, part of why I do prescribe and recommend abstinence trials or dopamine fasts is because it's very hard for us to see that true cause and effect in the moment. It's really a period of abstinence away from our drug of choice, whatever it may be, that allows our system to kind of settle down. The hard thing is that we do live in this kind of work hard, play hard environment where even the stressors are largely invisible and overwhelming. And then we naturally and reflexively reach for, intoxicants, from caffeine in the morning to our Netflix shows at night to our Ambien, whatever it is, as a way to try to compensate for a crazy making world. How do I think the world is crazy making? Well, first of all, we're almost all of us way too overstimulated. So the subtle ways in which we have to process way more information than our brains evolved for, where we have to respond to many more people and human contacts than we were really evolved for, where we have to kind of respond to these little intrusions on our attention all day long. The cumulative effect of that is really to stress out our brains so that we're always in reactive mode, and we're never really having those calm, lower stim moments that allow our brains to sort of recover and rejuvenate. And so it's like this, this work hard, play hard thing all day long. So I think there's a lot about, the ways in which our world, although it seems like life is really easy because we have so many of our sort of immediate survival needs met, is really a very stressful environment where we don't have the opportunity to sit quietly by ourselves or with others and just sort of restore in healthy ways.
Yeah, that's really well said. I actually agree with completely with what you said, and I appreciate the subtlety of stress, right? At one level, there's a lot of stresses we don't have to worry about.
Right.
But on another level, all those little perceptive, informational, situational novelties, and I figured this out working in the city, like sometimes I would see people on this amount of people on the street within an hour that maybe an ancient hunter-gatherer wouldn't see in their full lifetime.
Right. That's exactly right.
And the constant prediction of threat or safety with each person, the deeper awareness and the mind body is processing that whole time, right?
Right.
So like, at least for me it is.
Yeah.
Maybe for some people they're like, just blind trust, but for me it's like, okay, who's around me right now, right? So I get that, and I like that. I like that attention to the subtlety of the stress system and the situational stress that we're in, and how that actually leads to us being more predilection more towards some self-soothing, self-medicine, healing. So you're starting to talk about solutions in a certain way, and that's one of the things I definitely wanted to talk about with you today, is like the different kinds of solutions. And in your book, you have a really nice outline of them. One in particular, I definitely want to focus on, and it turns out, are you a Wordler? Do you do Wordle?
No, I don't. I know of it, but that's one of the many things I could easily get addicted to, so I avoid.
Good point of conversation. So today's word was truth.
Okay.
5-letter word was truth. I thought, oh, that's timely, because your section on radical honesty, I think is so tremendous, right? So on one level, you talk about, maybe we'll get to that as well, in terms of avoidance and abstinence and lower stim environments. So let's come back to that, because I already introduced this radical honesty idea. So let's talk about the importance of radical honesty in relationship to stress, and in relationship to pleasure and pain, and how that is restorative.
Yeah. So this is something I learned from my patients in recovery, seeing them over many years. A recurring theme, no matter how they got into recovery, was that my patients taught me they couldn't lie. It wasn't just that they couldn't lie about their drug use. They couldn't lie about anything if they wanted to be able to stay in recovery. They couldn't lie about what they had for breakfast, about where they were Saturday night, about why they were late for the meeting. And this was really fascinating to me, because it was such a tangible, practical thing that people can focus on, that seemed to have this very profound effect on appetitive control or consumptive behaviors. So in my curiosity and in researching it, what I learned is, first of all, that the average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. So we're all kind of natural liars, which means that in order to not lie, especially the small lies we tend to tell to cover up our own mistakes and shortcomings, we really have to make an effort to pay attention to it, right?
Yeah.
But that in doing that, we potentially gain a lot. And the first thing that I think we gain is insight, better insight into what we're actually doing. And that awareness is huge, because when we tell the stories of our lives, we're not just organizing past experience, we're actually creating a roadmap for future decision making. So if we're telling a story based on lies, we don't have access to very good information for future choices. But if we're trying hard to tell a story about our lives that adheres as closely as possible to the truth, then we potentially have just absolutely exploded the amount of information, that good information that we have at our fingertips to make good decisions going forward. It's also very possible that by actively and effortfully engaging in truth telling, we actually stimulate the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, that
And
was part of the book that I thought, wow, that's so fascinating.
yeah, isn't that interesting? So we know that when we take a TMS or a transcranial magnetic stimulator, and we stimulate the prefrontal cortex, which is the large gray matter area behind our foreheads, which acts as a kind of a brake on appetite and overconsumption. It's kind of where we have a lot of our control networks. So when we stimulate that exogenously with a magnet, what we see is that people who are engaging in a die rolling task are more likely to tell the truth in that gamified scenario, and less likely to cheat to win money.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is that it's also probably true that not only is that a top-down process, but that by actively engaging in truth-telling, we might be able to actually stimulate and strengthen the prefrontal cortex, which then in turn gives us more robust control circuits and more ability to maintain appetitive control, delay gratification, appreciate future consequences from current decision making, and craft more robust autobiographical narratives. So this kind of insight that we gain from truth telling is, I think, profound. The other big piece of it is that it promotes intimacy. So I think we all fear that if we tell somebody about our failures, shortcomings, mistakes, how we've lied, whatever it is, that they'll kind of run away screaming. But in fact, very often what happens is the opposite, and that people come closer to us, which is really interesting to me because we're so resistant to sharing our mistakes and talking about our shortcomings. We almost all want to craft a representation of ourselves that's just a little bit more exciting, more interesting, more talented, whatever it is.
There's that whole study with the people's which picture they think was really them, the one that was just a little bit more attractive, not a little less attractive, or the real one. Yeah. There's a bias there. Well, it gets into the work of Robert Trivers. Do you know who he is?
No. How do you spell the last name?
Trivers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had him on the podcast. He was one of the most unusual interviews I've had.
Nice.
Well, yeah. He came to a bar in Jamaica and was having beers on a Sunday afternoon. And,
okay.
He wrote some really seminal papers in the field of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. One of them you probably have heard of is parental investment theory.
Describe it a little bit and I'll tell you if I've heard of it.
Theory is basically that you can tell in most, I think nearly all species, who's going to do the choosing of a mate and who's going to do the fighting to mate. Basically, whoever puts the most time and energy into the offspring do the choosing. And then the other sex, the sex is going to fight. So basically, most of the time, because females carry,
right,
they're going to be more selective.
So wait a minute, the female already has children, but they're going to choose another mate?
No. So in reproductive sex, right? Sex. I'm not a scientist. I'm interesting acupuncturist who's doing some other. But the female who has to carry the energetic load, the stress of pregnancy, and then child rearing or raising whatever it is, a chimpanzee or whatever, that they're going to select, they're going to choose, right? They're going to
choose their mate.
Yeah, they're going to be more selective.
Okay.
About who they get involved with, because they take the load of the consequences falls on them, the energetic load.
Okay.
So in parental investment theory, the sex that has carrying the weight of pregnancy and child rearing, or offspring, we should say,
right,
it's the one that's going to be doing the selecting of the mate. And then the males are going to like grow the pretty feathers and dance, or they're going to fight with antlers and horns in order to compete to be selected.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so he was like 29 when he came up with that. He wrote like four
Mm-hmm.
incredibly accurate neo-Darwinian papers around
Mm-hmm.
how biology thinks.
Uh-huh,
What
nice.
are the principles there?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
one of them he that I've been really interested in, and it relates to stress, is deceit and self-deception.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he wrote a whole book on it. But to me, what I realize is one of the stress responses possibilities or the way people deal with stress is lie. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Self-deception, and that deception is an integral part of the animal world. You know,
Mm-hmm. It is,
whether
yeah.
an animal throws some eggs and somebody else is like feeding their young so they don't have to, or a parasite's pretending like it's something else so it can get into the system. There's like deception and truth are an incredible part of whether things are stressful. And circling back to that amazing point you made about that, it's just better, it's more to do the sensible thing is sometimes harder, but it makes more sense in the long term, and you're not expending extra energy worrying about things. And that's the cost of deceit and self-deception on this. Is it's stressful.
Mm-hmm.
Can't,
Mm-hmm.
we can't trust in our, it's like you were talking about, we can't trust our environment to be there for us. Well, what if we can't trust ourselves to be there for us? So this is my way of how my brain kind of starts putting these bits of information together in terms of what you're talking about with truth telling and
Right.
recovery, and the importance of how that deloads the stress.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm actually being truthful right now. So I've been interested in this connection between truth telling
Mm-hmm.
and stress for a while as it relates to deception.
Mm-hmm.
Deception,
Mm-hmm.
like a maybe the short term donut strategy of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Telling's more like, yeah, that's like quinoa and kale and a nice. What I mean? It,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I love how your brain can go across these disciplines. It's cool. Yeah. So what my patients will tell me, and they have told me over the years, is that as part of their addiction, they get into the lying habit, where it might start out as lying about covering use, but after a while, they just lie. They're like lying machines. One patient told me that when he was in his addiction from heroin, if he was getting lunch at McDonald's and somebody called him up and said, "Hey, where are you, man?" He'd say, "Oh, I'm at Burger King." If he was getting lunch at Burger King and they'd say, "Hey, where are you, man?" He'd say, "I'm at McDonald's." Like, it didn't even make any sense. There was no reason for it. But lying had just become kind of a reflexive behavior that was part and
Would you say
parcel.
there could be small pleasures in the deceit? Maybe there was a little bit of
Some of that, kind of like that, no one's going to pin me down and no one's going to tell me what to do or where I am. But what patients, in recovery will almost universally say, with regards to your comment in particular, is that then the lying itself becomes a huge source of stress.
Yeah.
Because then you're like having to remember what you said to this person versus what you said to that person. Of course, some of the lies get found out. Then you have a breach of trust and a loss of intimacy and ruined relationships and lost jobs and, maybe legal problems. It just goes on and on.
Yeah.
Not to mention just the incredible stress that goes along with having to remember all the lies and maintain them over time.
Yeah.
And with truth telling and recovery, a big part of it is just this sense of relief that you don't have to carry that around anymore, that you can just, tell people what's really going on or what's really on your mind. And then the sort of shock that comes with people not responding the way that you would have predicted, usually responding much better, right? So having this idea in your mind, oh, when I tell this person this thing, they're going to break up with me, or they're going to hate my guts, or they're going to do some other, and instead finding that that's not at all how people respond, and that people are very loving and generous. They just want to know the truth. And so, I mean, to me, it's just fascinating how much we don't understand the impact of our lies, the negative impact. And we have so many illusions and fantasies about how we're protecting ourselves. We're actually helping other people by lying, all this kind of stuff, which just simply isn't true. But I think it's partially vestigial, again, from an evolutionary perspective, because as you say, all living organisms lie, even nonverbal living organisms. So there's a form of a beetle that will invade an ant's nest by coating itself with the pheromones or the smell of the ant's chemicals and deceive the colony because they'll mistake it as another ant. I mean, there's so many examples in nature. Right. And the ways that, humans use deception is primarily through language, and language is a tool. We can use language as a weapon and a shield. And if you're in a state where you're facing off with some kind of enemy, I mean, of course, we're going to lie with language, right? That's a way that we will protect ourselves and the people that we care about. But what's happened in the modern era is that we are under stress, but we're under stress for non-intuitive reasons. We're under stress really because of what I call the plenty paradox, which is that we have too much of everything, and we're consumption machines evolved to grab whatever we can and eat as much as we can whenever we can, because in a world of scarcity, which is the world we evolved in, you don't know when you're getting your next meal or your next bit of shelter or water. But the problem is that we don't live in that world. We live in this world of incredible abundance. So we're all getting addicted in an addiction mode, which then in and of itself fuels lying and deception, which then in and of itself fuels this sense of being in survival mode, which is a scarcity mindset, which is this idea that I need to lie more to get more of that, which is, of course, insane because we have so much of anything. So to get out of that loop of self and other deception, compulsive overconsumption and addiction, isolation, shame, more deception, more consumption, it really can begin with truth-telling as the starting place to get out of that vicious loop. And it's not, it's so interesting to me that simple practical step of just being like, I'm going to start telling the truth can be the starting place for recovery from compulsive overconsumption and addiction.
Yeah. And then you started talking about this doing less, using less stimulation. Right.
Yeah.
I want to just put a plug if there's any young people listening. I think about young people a lot, and I think about what they're facing in the world, and just thinking about people who are thinking about young people and us who are responsible for looking after young people as a parent or whatever role we have. What's the value, and what would you say in terms of what we get by less stimulation that may not be obvious, and maybe build that idea out to even this committed periods of refraining or abstinence, or this dopamine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think what I try to communicate is that overabundance itself is a stressor. We have all this great technology, all this great stuff, great, but too much of it is a bad thing. And that's the state that we are in now. And so we are really stressed out because of overabundance, which means that the intervention to reduce our stress is to reduce abundance, right? To not do things, to refrain, to destimulate, to slow it down, to have less stimulation, to consume less, to kind of try to create an environment that is to some degree an ascetic environment, right? Asceticism being this idea of intentionally seeking out painful or difficult things, intentionally abstaining.
Or even simplicity, like Zen.
Yeah, right. Simplicity, right.
Smaller, simpler.
Yeah. And I think what I really espouse is, retreats are great, like, meditation retreats or whatever, that's all great. And I think that can be effective. But I really mean in our everyday lives, just slowing it down, getting quieter, having some time away from our devices, going on a walk without listening to a podcast, even though podcasts are great, especially your podcast, right? but still, like,
you're lying right now. Is that one of your two lies today?
No, I'm sure your podcast is great.
Oh, I'm teasing them.
but but even with all that wonderfulness, like just kind of quieter, less stimulation.
Yeah. No, I think it's important. And there's something else I want to say, and I wonder if you share this sentiment. But as I've been working through my thoughts around stress and how to work with it, I think one of the messages I think young people get, and in some certain way, we're kind of naming it. It's true. Like we're up against a certain novel stress that you know, no other generation of humans has really been in before.
Right.
Quite like what we have since, devices and phones and globalism and the rest. And so, but I like to think that the message that we need is not just that, yeah, there are really stresses or there are really addictive risks in the world, thinking about young people in particular, but also that we're evolved to and we're resourced more than we know in order to handle it.
Right.
There's a kind
Right.
of a depth, a wisdom that comes out in through, those who are able to recover from the most extreme addictions, even, or even just everyday adversities in our lives to remind ourselves that inside ourselves, we have a repository of stress responses or a natural understanding around what's good and right use of our energy in relationship to pleasure, in relationship
Right.
to activity. So do you have a similar kind of sentiment around the pleasure pain story and the dopamine relationship of our motivational circuits that can go awry, that can go really awry, which you've seen and you've known in depth for years, that you kind of say, and even still, this is why I feel hopeful about who we are and how we can feel good about ourselves?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm very hopeful. I mean, humans are amazingly adaptive, and we figure these things out. But I do think that a really important insight, that we used to know that we've forgotten in the last couple hundred years, is that we really are wired for hardship. We are wired for stress, and in the absence of adequate hardship or stress, whatever language you want to use, our brains and bodies get super confused. We start to, misinterpret all kinds of signals because we're not moving in our bodies against a certain degree of friction, which is really what we were built for. And now we're in the position of having to kind of artificially manufacture or create that kind of friction to stay healthy. But we need to do that because we're not meant to just sit around and have stuff delivered to our doorstep, which is the world that we live in now.
Yeah. No, it reminds me of one of the clearest moments I had was I was going for a header in a soccer game and the goalie hit the ball, but then he went through and hit my nose. So I got like just clocked in the nose, right? Just really hard. But after the blood stopped and all that, I was like, I feel really clear headed right now.
Right.
There's something about
Yeah.
that dose of pain that was just like, I feel really clear in myself. And so there's something about exposing ourselves at some level to the physical friction because we
Right.
have a lot of mental friction, right?
Yeah.
But
I do think that anecdote, prompts me to want to say that people are different also in terms of the amount of stress that
sure.
they can tolerate and what turns out to be. And some people, they're really, really wired for stress. Like they get punched in the face and they feel clear-headed. For other people, that really might not be the case. So, it's important to recognize like what is the optimal amount of stress for a given person.
Well said. Fair enough. I think that's really I like your sensitivity to that and whoever's listening right now and that there's no general amount of stress that's right for any one person.
Yeah, that's right, for every person. But I think in general, we as a species today underestimate our need for the right kinds of stress, that we actually need that in our lives and we should welcome it. And part of it is mindset, part of it is how we think about it. And if we start to get afraid of it, then we compound our problems. Whereas if we say, oh, this is an opportunity, for me to reset my physiology, for me to appreciate what I have, whatever.
No, I agree, and I think that's where another place where stress and pleasure and pain interface, right? In terms of, um, and I think yeah, this idea that we, through friction, through resistance, through a bit of adversity, maybe through some discomfort, even occasional pain, that somehow, for some of us, it's clarifying. For others, it's somehow beneficial to the biology that we're
Right.
trying to shepherd through the story of our lives and make sense.
Right.
Yeah, I get that. Anything else to close out that you want to bring today, Dr. Lemke?
Gosh, our conversation was wide ranging, wasn't it? um, no, I think that's good. I think, I mean, you had mentioned early on sort of uncertainty and how uncertainty plays a role in creating stress. Ironically, I think that's more true today than ever before. Even though we have more control over our environment than ever before, it's such another interesting paradox.
Yeah, we're caught in them, and I agree that is like the plenty paradox, or this kind of uncertainty paradox, where there's a weird twist. It reminds me of this New Yorker cartoon where there's a couple and they're in their living room and reading the newspaper, and they're like, the world seems fine from here. Like in this comfortable house and everything,
Yes.
okay, but like outside, and it really is more than ever
Yeah.
feeling today and this weekend that the world's a bit crazy. But these paradoxes, and I kind of feel, for me, the way I walk with it is like, okay, if I'm evolved to meet and adapt to the stresses of my life,
Right.
then these are our stresses to embrace. These
Right.
weird paradoxes and these weird complex situations that we find ourselves in with all the things that we've talked about today. That's part of our job, is to stand up, meet that, find ourselves in that, learn about ourselves, let the homeostatic, I can love myself, I can understand and listen to myself, I can be authentic, and I can still find that resourcefulness to stand in the world and stand with the world as it's unfolding in a way that's not just hopeless or not just addicted. Yeah. So
Yeah, I love that. And I agree with you. And I think that's a powerful reframe, as opposed to the frame of like, oh, I need to look out for triggers, because if I'm triggered, I might not be able to cope, this type of thing. So yeah, I agree.
thank you very much for being on the show today. It was great to have you. I look
Yeah,
forward to the
thanks
next
for
book. Are you working on a next book yet?
not well. We're actually working now on a workbook. There are a lot of fake Dopamine Nation workbooks out there, so I'm trying to get a real Dopamine Nation workbook that might enable people to sort of put some of the principles into practice. So
I think that's a great idea. I look
thanks.
forward to seeing that out on the market.
Okay, great.
All right. All the
Great.
best to you. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Bye.
Bye bye.